A mainline railroad is not supposed to climb like this. The rule book every American surveyor carried said a hard grade was 2%, a sharp curve was 10 degrees, and anything steeper was a mistake waiting to kill a crew. Then, in eastern Utah, a company drew a line that climbed at 7.5% for 5 unbroken miles and bent through a curve of 66 degrees. Every engineer who read that survey said the same thing. You cannot run a railroad here. They built it anyway, and most of it out of timber, by hand. The man who ordered it built was John M. Mack, president of the asphalt company that owned the ground. The cargo he was chasing was a black mineral named for a Utah prospector called Samuel Henry Gilson. And the thing that still stands today, more than a century later, is the wood. At a place called Whiskey Creek, a timber trestle the crews drove by hand is the one piece of this railroad the desert has not managed to take back. The notch they crossed is Baxter Pass, 8,437 feet up in the Book Cliffs of eastern Utah. The railway that climbed it was the Uinta Railway, and it opened in 1904. In under 6 miles, the line gained more than 2,000 feet of height. I want to walk through what it actually took to put a railroad up that mountain with hand tools, horses, and lumber, because the grade is only where the trouble starts. Almost none of it would have happened without gilsonite. The rock looks like coal and behaves like nothing else. It is light and brittle, it breaks in a shiny black fracture, and it will not burn in your stove. What it does instead is melt into paint, varnish, waterproofing, and printing ink. And by the 1880s, the factories back east wanted every pound of it they could buy. The catch was the address. The only deposits worth mining sat in the Uinta Basin, some of the most cut-off country in the West, a long way from any rail. It is worth remembering who was pulling on the far end of this line. Gilsonite was not a curiosity mineral. It went into the paints and varnishes that coated American houses and machines, into waterproofing and insulation, and into the heavy black inks that printed the nation's newspapers. An Eastern asphalt company had built a real business on the stuff and wanted a supply it controlled outright. That is why a corporation with no romance at all about mountains was willing to pay to cross one. A specific and growing industrial demand, 1,000 miles away back east, made a stranded desert mineral worth more than the enormous cost of reaching it. For the company, the mountain was just an expense on the way to the seam. Gilson is the man who made that rock famous, though he did not find it first. He was born in Illinois in 1836 and left for the California goldfields before he turned 15. He raised horses for the Pony Express. He ranched in Nevada. He prospected, he invented an ore machine that worked, and a flying machine that did not, and he served as a United States Marshal at the execution of John D. Lee. Somewhere in the middle of that life he got hold of the black rock from the basin, and from 1886 on, he promoted it so hard that it took his name. Chemists call it uintite. Everyone else called it gilsonite. But there was a barrier in front of the mineral that had nothing to do with mountains. The richest gilsonite lay inside the Uinta and Ouray Reservation, on land that belonged to the Ute people, where outside mining was not allowed. For the deposits to be worked at all, that ground first had to be pried open. Gilson's partner, a promoter named Bert Seabolt, went to Washington in 1887, and again the next year, to press Congress on exactly that. And in 1888, over the objection of the Federal Indian Office, Congress detached a strip of about 7,000 acres of the richest ground from the reservation and opened it to mining. Only then could the first claims go in. The railroad that would one day climb Baxter Pass was still 16 years in the future, and the fight to reach this mineral had already reached the floor of Congress. Gilson had made the mineral famous. Getting it out of the basin was a different problem, and it belonged to Mack. The deposits were controlled by the Eastern Asphalt Company he ran, and Mack looked at a fortune in mineral stranded behind a wall of cliffs and made a decision most men in his chair would not have signed. He would build a railroad in to get it, not a wagon road, but a genuine common carrier railroad, over the Book Cliffs and down into the basin, to reach a single surface seam the miners called the Black Dragon. That seam ran along open ground for 4 miles and averaged 6 feet wide, and it was worth more to him than the mountain standing in front of it. Here is what made the whole idea sound insane to the men who built railroads for a living. A railroad is a machine for defeating slope. Steel wheels on steel rail have almost no grip, and on the flat that is the entire point, because it lets one small engine pull enormous weight. On a hill, that same smoothness turns lethal. This is why the great American main lines were surveyed to hold 1 or 2% wherever the money could buy it, and why engineers spent fortunes on tunnels and long looping detours just to keep a grade gentle. 2% was steep, 4% was a mountain emergency. The climb to Baxter Pass held 7.5% for 5 miles without a break. The curves were worse, if anything. A gentle railroad curve turns a few degrees, and 10 degrees was already considered sharp. At a place on the line called Morro Castle, the track bent so hard that the early accounts put it at 75 degrees, and even after the surveyors went back, measured it honestly, and brought the number down to 66, it was still the sharpest curve on any common carrier railroad in the United States. A bend like that has a radius of under 90 feet. You could stand on the inside of it and watch the front of your own train come around to face you. So why not do it properly? Why not tunnel the ridge, or take the long, gentle way around? The answer is the answer to almost every hard question about this railroad. Money. A standard gauge line built to normal grades, with the tunnels and the fills and the heavy bridges that implies, would have cost a fortune the asphalt company was never going to spend on a mineral spur in the desert. So the engineers threw out the rulebook on purpose. They built to 3-foot narrow gauge, which let the track wrap around tight curves a wider railroad could never take. They let the grade run brutally steep, so the line could follow the shape of the land, instead of cutting through it. And they accepted that the whole thing would have to be run slow, and careful, and on nerve. Before any of that could be built, someone had to find the line. And this is the first place the record goes quiet on me. The company's engineers walked that country on foot, with a transit and a steel chain and a level, and they located a line up the West Salt Wash and over the pass one stake at a time. They chose where every curve would fall and how the grade would climb. It is some of the hardest location work done on any American railroad, and the surviving company papers kept the grade, the curve, and the elevation to the foot. They just never wrote down the name of the man who ran that survey. He located the impossible line, and then he vanished out of his own records. What his crews laid out was a climb of 2,012 feet in 5 8/10 miles, from the shop town of Atchee to the summit. That is not a figure you glide up. That is a wall the whole railroad had to be engineered to fight, every single day it ran. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. And the hard climb did not even begin at the mountain. From the junction at Mack, the line first had to work its way 28 miles up a dry valley called the West Salt Wash, just to reach Atchee at the foot of the real grade. That first stretch alone is where 36 of the railroad's bridges stood, one wash and gully after another, before the serious climbing had started at all. And everything that rode this railroad had to change cars at Mack, because the Uinta was 3-foot narrow gauge, and it met the standard gauge Denver and Rio Grande Western there. Every sack of gilsonite coming off the mountain had to be lifted out of the little cars and reloaded into full-size ones for the trip east. That break of gauge was a cost the company simply swallowed, because narrow gauge was the only way the line could ever have wrapped around the mountain above. To picture the problem those surveyors faced, you have to picture the Book Cliffs themselves. They are a long, high wall of rock that runs for many miles across this corner of Utah and Colorado, rising in steep steps and offering very few places where anything could get over. Baxter Pass was the notch the survey settled on, and even that notch was brutal. The whole art of locating the line was finding a route a train could physically climb across ground that had never been meant to carry one. Skipping the expensive tunnels was the entire point, and the price of skipping them was a grade and a set of curves that broke the rules. There was no way around that bargain, so the men who built the Uinta stopped fighting it and designed the railroad to live with it. Now start with the roadbed itself, the shelf of level ground the rails sit on. On the Uinta, there were no steam shovels doing that work on the mountain. The grade was cut by men with picks and shovels, by horse teams dragging slip scrapers, and by black powder set into the rock by hand. Where the line crossed the face of the Book Cliffs, crews hung on a slope that fell away beneath them and carved a bench just wide enough for a narrow gauge track. Every cut was moved by muscle and animal. Every fill was hauled, dumped, and tamped the same way. It was slow and dangerous work, and there was not a single machine anywhere on that mountain to do it for them. Then there was the wood, This was a railroad built out of timber, and that was a deliberate choice, not a compromise. Stone viaducts and steel spans cost money and time and skilled trades the company did not want to pay for out in that emptiness. Wood was cheap, it was fast, and a framing crew could raise a trestle far quicker than a mason could lay an arch. So the Uinta crossed its canyons on wooden trestles, bent after bent, timber stacked and pinned into towers that carried the rail across open air. The men built those trestles the old way, by hand and by pile driver. A pile driver is a simple and punishing machine. A heavy iron weight is hauled up a wooden frame and dropped, over and over, hammering a timber pile down into the creek bed until it will not move another inch. Crews drove the piles, framed the bents on top of them, and pinned the whole structure together with iron and hard labor. One of those spans is still there. Out at Whiskey Creek, a pile-driven trestle from this railroad is the last piece of the Uinta left remotely intact, generations after the final train. It was an ordinary trestle by the standards of its own line. Ordinary, for the Uinta, still means a hand-built timber bridge that has outlived the entire railroad around it. Counting the whole route, from Mack all the way west to Watson, the crews raised 73 of these bridges. A wooden trestle is not a build-it-and-walk-away structure either. Timber out in the weather checks and splits and works loose, and a bridge made of wood on a railroad that ran fire-breathing engines across it lived under a constant threat of burning, so the trestles had to be walked, inspected, and repaired without end. Rotten timbers were pulled and replaced while trains still crossed. On a line with that many bridges, the work never stopped, and it was one more job that fell on the crews out on the mountain. Maintaining the railroad was a permanent hand labor job in its own right, bent by bent, year after year, holding the timber up against rot and fire and the plain weight of the trains. Now look at what that steep, cheap philosophy did to the track itself. Because the builders followed the land instead of carving through it, the line had to double back on itself constantly to gain height. It would run up a side canyon just to turn around and come back down the far wall a little higher. Railroaders gave these hairpins names. There was a mule shoe curve, where the track bent back on itself like the shoe it was named for. There was the horseshoe at Morro Castle. Strung together, all these reversals earned the line a nickname up and down the western railroads. They called it the crookedest railroad in the West, and for once the nickname was just a plain reading of the survey. Every one of those curves was a tax the railroad paid forever. A tight curve grabs at the wheels and fights the train. Put that sharpest bend in the middle of the steep grade, which is exactly what this line did, and you have built a place where an engine is clawing uphill and fighting the rail in the same instant. The men who ran the Uinta lived inside that combination on every single trip. For all its reputation as a mineral railroad, remember that the Uinta was a common carrier, which meant it carried more than gilsonite. It hauled the mail. It hauled express freight. It hauled sheep and wool for the ranchers of the basin. And for a while it carried people. Passenger service started in 1905, and it was a humble thing, usually a small tank engine pulling a single combination car, part coach and part baggage room, up and over the pass. For the towns strung along the line, it was very nearly the only way in or out. Mail came in over the Uinta to Mack, rode the little trains west, and then went on by wagon from Dragon, deeper into the basin toward Vernal. The passenger trains stopped running in 1921, but for those years, if you needed to cross that country, this steep little line was how you did it. So how do you actually run a train up a wall like that? Very slowly, and with a particular kind of engine. On the steep mountain end of the line, the Uinta used Shay locomotives, which are strange-looking machines. Instead of the big driving rods you picture on a steam engine, a Shay has a row of gears down one side turning every wheel, which trades away speed for raw pulling grip. A Shay does not run fast. It runs like a mountain goat, geared low, gripping the rail, made for exactly this kind of impossible slope. At Atchee, the shop town at the foot of the hard grade, crews would swap power, putting the geared engines on for the mountain and rod engines on for the gentler running beyond. Going up the grade was a hard, grinding fight. Coming back down was dangerous, in an entirely different way. A loaded train easing down a grade of 7.5% is a runaway looking for an excuse, and the entire job of the crew was to keep it from finding one. Brakes, sand poured on the rail for grip, and a careful hand on the throttle were all that stood between a controlled descent and a wreck, and the load riding behind them made the stakes worse. Because the cargo was gilsonite, and gilsonite burns. The mineral came down the mountain packed in burlap sacks, 150 to 200 pounds each, stacked on open flat cars. Sparks from a laboring steam engine, a hot brake shoe, a dry sack of a substance that goes into varnish for a living, all of it riding the steepest common carrier grade in the country. These men were hauling flammable rock down a mountain on wooden cars behind a fire-breathing engine, and they did it for decades. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. And then there was winter, which turned the whole line into a different kind of problem. High on Baxter Pass, the snow came in enormous quantities. Drifts could stand as tall as the windows of a passenger car, and the same grade that was merely brutal in summer became genuinely deadly under packed snow and ice. Keeping the pass open was a fight the crews took up every year, digging and plowing the line clear so the gilsonite could keep moving. Sometimes the mountain simply won for a while. In 1929, a huge slide came down and buried part of the line, the kind of event that could cut the basin off from the outside until men and shovels reopened it. Every winter, the railroad's survival came down to crews out in the cold, clearing a path across a mountain that was actively trying to close it. The mountain collected its worst debt on one of those winter nights. On the 10th of February 1909, in a snowstorm near the top of the pass, Shea engine number 3 went off the rails. The man at the throttle was Joseph E. Lane, an engineer the crews called Doc. He was killed in the wreck, so was a second man working beside him, a Greek laborer whose name the record never wrote down. Hold on that for a moment, because it is the whole story in miniature. The company kept the engine number, it kept the date, it kept the name of the engineer, Doc Lane. The immigrant who died on the same mountain, on the same night, in the same wreck, went into the ground unnamed in the ledger. The Uinta was built and run by a lot of men like him, Greek and otherwise, whose labor is all over this railroad, and whose names are almost entirely gone from it. By the 1920s, the railroad was in trouble. Labor cost more, the equipment was aging, and the little geared engines were wearing out against that grade. The man running the line then was Lucian Sprague, and Sprague went looking for more power. What he ordered is still hard to believe. In 1926, the Baldwin Locomotive Works delivered engine number 50, an articulated narrow-gauge machine that weighed 236,000 pounds and pulled with about 42,000 pounds of force. 2 years later, its sister, number 51, arrived 10,000 pounds heavier still. That second engine, number 51, was the largest and heaviest narrow-gauge steam locomotive ever built, anywhere in the world. Here is the piece of engineering that makes those giants make sense. A locomotive that big should never have been able to get around the sharpest curve on the line. A rigid engine that long would simply bind against the rails and climb off them. The answer was to build it in two halves. These were articulated engines, which means the locomotive was hinged in the middle, with two separate sets of driving wheels under one long boiler, so the front half could swing sideways to follow the bend, while the rear half stayed under the cab. They were also tank engines, carrying their own water and fuel in tanks wrapped around the boiler instead of trailing a separate tender, so they could pull hard in either direction on a line that had almost nowhere to turn a big engine around. A monster that could bend in the middle was the only kind of monster this railroad could actually use. Think about what that means. This tiny 3-foot railroad in the Utah desert, put together as cheaply as its owners could manage, ended up rostering the biggest narrow-gauge steam engine in the history of the gauge, for one reason: the grade demanded it. The line was so hard that keeping it alive required a machine nobody else on Earth needed. Sprague himself went on from this desert railroad to rescue a bankrupt main line in the Midwest, the Minneapolis and St. Louis, and made his name doing it. Step back from the machinery and look at what this line actually did, year after year. It reached in and unlocked a mineral that had been sitting useless in the ground because there was no way to carry it out. By some accounts, the Uinta Basin was turning out something on the order of 50,000 tons a year in this era, and this railroad was how most of it reached the outside world. Every ton went up and over Baxter Pass on that grade, around that curve, across the timber trestles, in burlap sacks on open cars. A substance in your grandfather's paint and varnish and printing ink very likely rode down a mountain on the crookedest railroad in the country to get to him. And every ton of that mineral was dug out by hand too, long before it ever reached a rail car. Gilsonite sits in the ground in tall, near-vertical veins, sheets of black rock standing on edge and running deep, so the only way to mine it was to follow the vein down. Men went into narrow cuts and shafts along the Black Dragon, broke the brittle mineral loose, and hauled it up to the surface in the heat and the dust. Then it was sacked in burlap and stacked in the open to wait for the train. The mineral was dangerous underground, as well as on the cars, because gilsonite dust hangs in the close air of a working mine, and it burns, so a spark in the wrong place was a constant fear down in the cuts. The digging, the breaking, the sacking, the loading, and the long haul over the pass, every stage of it came down to men and animals. From the vein all the way to the rail, this was work done by hand. The railroad even grew for a while. In 1911, the company pushed the line further, 9.5 miles onto a place called Watson, and then another 4 miles to reach a second gilsonite mine at Rainbow. Little towns grew up wherever the rails and the mines met. Dragon, at the end of the original line, and Watson, out past it, were company towns that existed for one reason: to dig the mineral and load it onto the trains. Today both of them are ghost towns. There is almost nothing left of either one. When the railroad that made them died, the towns had no reason to keep breathing, and the desert took them the same way it took the tracks. The world this line served was almost unimaginably cut off. Atchee, the shop town at the foot of the grade, existed only because the railroad did. It was named for a peaceful Ute chief, and it sat in country so remote that the railroad was the town's one real lifeline in and out. The crews who kept the line open lived there, maintained the engines there, and fought the mountain from there in every season. When the snow came, they were the ones who dug the line out. When a trestle needed work, they were the ones who went out onto the timber. There was no calling for help from anywhere close. The nearest solid connection to the rest of the country was that standard gauge junction back at Mac, Colorado, the town named for the same Mac who had ordered the whole railroad built. That daily competence is the part that tends to get lost when a railroad like this becomes a curiosity. The Uinta is famous now mostly as a novelty, the crookedest little line in the West, a favorite of rail fans and model builders. That fame is earned, but it skips the actual achievement, which was never the strangeness of the line. It was that ordinary crews, with pre-machined tools, built and ran a railroad in a place the rulebook said was impossible, and held it open for 35 years. Now let me follow the railroad to its end, because the way it died says almost as much as the way it was built. The grade never beat the Uinta. The truck did. By the 1930s, gasoline trucks on improving roads could carry gilsonite out of the basin without any of the enormous cost of maintaining 73 timber bridges and a mountain grade that tried to kill somebody every winter. The math that had justified the railroad in 1904 finally ran the other way. A truck needed no pile-driven trestle. A truck did not care how sharp the curve was. And a truck did not ask a crew to risk the descent every single day. So the owners made the same cold kind of decision Mac had made at the start, only in reverse. On the 16th of May, 1939, the last train ran on the Uinta Railway. The men on it are in the record. Roy Eno had the throttle as engineer. George Lohman was the fireman. John Beaslin was the conductor. The superintendent who saw it end, E.V. Earp, had been hired onto the line 27 years before. They took the last train down the mountain, and then the railroad that everyone said could not be built was quietly taken apart. The rails were pulled up and carried off. The famous engines were scattered to other lines and to scrappers. And the desert set about doing what deserts do. If you go out there now, most of the Uinta is a set of scars in the ground, a grade cut into the side of the book cliffs, the stubs of trestle bents, the empty bench where Atchee stood. The town is gone. The shops are gone. The little geared shays are gone. What is left is the shape of the work. The grade is still legible in the dirt, climbing at that impossible angle toward the pass, because a line cut by hand into a mountain does not simply erase inside a human lifetime. Out at Whiskey Creek, the timber trestle still stands, the last intact piece of a railroad that has otherwise vanished, holding up a track that is no longer there. And the numbers are still in the record: 7.5%, 66 degrees, 2,000 feet of climb in under 6 miles, 73 bridges. The papers kept all of it. What the papers did not keep is most of the men. That is the thing I keep coming back to with the Uinta. We know the engine numbers and the tonnages and the grade to 0.1%. We know the names at the top: Gilson, who made the mineral famous; Mack, who ordered the line; Sprague, who fed it those giant engines. But the surveyor who located the impossible grade is a blank. The Greek laborer who died near the top of the pass is a blank. Most of the men who cut the bench, drove the piles, and rode the brakes down the mountain are blanks. There is no roll of their names anywhere, only the work they left in the ground. The ledger kept the grade. It did not keep them. And here is the claim I will leave you with, the one worth arguing about below. We tend to assume that anything the people of 1904 could build, a modern crew could obviously build faster and better today. With the Uinta, I am genuinely not sure that is true. It is not a question of machines. We have machines those men could not have dreamed of. I am not sure a modern railroad would even be permitted to exist at 7.5% and 66 degrees, or that a modern company would accept the risk that these crews accepted as a normal Tuesday for 3.5 decades. The Uinta took engineering, and more than that, it took nerve. And nerve is the part that never shows up in the specifications. The mountain is still there. The grade they cut into it is still there. And the rule book they broke to put it there still says it should never have worked. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.